Hi. I've been hearing a lot of people saying that they feel as if they're in a sort of limbo at the moment, which is understandable. Limbo means to be caught in between two things, but it also has this suggestion of waiting for something to resolve itself in order to come out of that limbo. And what I've been feeling God speaking to me about is that actually he wants us to inhabit the in-between. He wants us to learn how to live in the in-between of two things. And what I mean by that is best summed up in bits and pieces that I've been picking up from the book of Joshua. I feel like he's been showing me from the book of Joshua about the people as they were about to cross Jordan and go into the promised land. And previous to that, the people have been in the wilderness, they've done their wanderings, they've had various battles, and now they've come to this place called Shittim, which is on the edge of the river Jordan. And then God comes and says to Joshua, consecrate yourself and tell the people to consecrate themselves, because within 3 days you will be going over Jordan, going in to possess the land. That's how near they were to going into the promised land. But at the point is receiving this is still in the wilderness. And so they're in this kind of in-between place where they can see, I don't know whether they could see to the other side of Jordan, but they could see, at least from what God was saying, that the end is in sight, the promised land is coming. And I think for many of us, we've heard God speaking to us during this time about how he wants us to use us when we come through this period of lockdown. But it's as if we've all gone into this waiting type of a situation, this limbo. And yet we're meant to be a people who know how to inhabit the in-between. I mean, in the sense of the wider Christian faith, that is where we should be living every day anyway, because we live in that in-between, between Christ having come and inaugurated his church, to that place where Christ will come back to fully realise the kingdom that he's built. And so we're living in that in-between stage, and that should be impacting our life in the everyday now. But I think sometimes we forget that, and we kind of trudge on in our everyday lives, losing sight of that at times. But what I kind of have felt is that this time where this pandemic has been having its effect, whilst we can all see it maybe as, oh gosh, we're waiting for it to end, nevertheless, I feel that God has impressed upon me that actually this is a major point in world history. This is a point in the history of our nations, and it's a point in the history of the church that one day we will look back on and see what God has done at this turning point in the nations. But we can't see that right now because we're in the middle of it. It's a bit like some of these programs that I like to watch, where people get an architect in and they get a designer in and they rehash their house to such a pitch that by the end of the program the house looks nothing like it did at the beginning. And we might see all that take place within the space of an hour. But in practice, what happens is it probably takes years, because they kind of come along at different points, and they might have got an architect's drawing, but the people don't know exactly what it's going to look like at the end. And all they do is keep seeing it with the plaster peeled off and the brickwork being pulled down, walls pulled down, maybe props holding the ceiling up, and so on. And so it's hard to envisage possibly the end result. And sometimes they're living in that, they're camping out in a spare room somewhere with a makeshift kitchen and a makeshift this and that, whilst they're on the road to having this house done. Well, actually that's how we are right now. We are being transformed from one thing to another, and something of the old has gone. And one of the points in Joshua that he had previously spoken to me about was where he said it's the time to break up the camp. In other words, you've lived here long enough, you've dwelt here long enough, now break camp and follow the Spirit, follow the cloud, follow the pillar of fire, because there's a move going to happen. And so as we are people who follow the Spirit, we've left something of the old. but we're not yet seeing the fullness of the new. And so we only have this kind of architect drawing that we can feel that we're going by, or we only have these senses of what it might look like. Nevertheless, God is moving us on. And one of the things in Joshua that the Lord says to Joshua is, be bold and be very courageous. And I want to say that that's what I think is another thing that the Lord is saying right now. Be bold and be very courageous. So then he moves on and says, right, he tells all the people, in 3 days we're going over the Jordan. And he says, consecrate yourselves, because we're going over the Jordan within 3 days, and we're going to go in to possess the land. So what he's saying there is, get yourselves ready, be in readiness, be in that place where you're looking to God and you're expectant for God to do something. Commit yourselves again to him, and leave behind all these old battles. I think the battles they had in the wilderness were mainly battles to do with attitudes and thinking patterns, and whether they were moaning or grumbling, or whether they were not trusting God for daily provision, for the water, and God did provide for them the manna and the water. And nevertheless, they were continually moaning, and so they had to keep learning things. They had to keep putting their attitudes right. At one point they were into idol worship. And so these were the battles they had in the wilderness, but these would not be the battles in the immediacy of going over into Canaan and into the promised land. And so God is saying, consecrate yourselves, commit yourselves afresh to God, which I think is another thing he's saying. And then one of the first things that happens when they do go over Jordan is, the first major thing that happens is that they are circumcised. And that again is another sign of being just totally given and committed to God. In the book of Joshua, in the Old Testament, that was a sign that these were people that belonged to Yahweh, that they were God's people. And so in the New Testament we read about circumcising our hearts, that we are to look different because we're committed to God. Wherever he's wanting to send us and whatever he's wanting us to say, we are fully committed to him. And that will cause us to look different, because we're going to find ourselves wanting to do and say things that people don't like. And some of the battles, when they first get over into the promised land, are not about attitudes anymore. And it's like we can think, well, we're waiting to get into the promises. And when that happens, maybe we've got this idea, well, we'll just fall into that. We will just find ourselves in the promises of God. But actually the people had to fight. They had to be prepared to walk round Jericho. They had to be prepared to fight some battles. They had to be prepared to be proactive in taking hold of the promises. And so I think that's another thing that God is saying to us, that as we're in this in-between, one of the things we need to do is prepare ourselves to be proactive to take hold of the promises of God. In the time that the people of Israel came out of Egypt, when Moses was leading them, he sent spies into the promised land, and the spies came back with tales of unbelief, and as a result they wandered around for 40 years and never went into that wilderness and into that promised land. But now when Joshua sends in the spies, they come back with faith in their hearts to say, yes, we can do this, we can go in. And I think a lot of us have sensed that, yes, we can do this, God is up to something, we're going in. But let's be proactive in taking hold of what he wants us to do, he wants us to say, even if that makes us look different to our peers, even if that makes us look different in the eyes of our neighbours and our friends, because we are meant to be a different people, a peculiar people who have been called out and chosen by God. And so I just want to finish this off by just reiterating, it's a time to consecrate yourself, recommit yourself. It's a time to be prepared to be proactive, and it's a time to be bold and be very courageous. And most of all, it's a time to learn to live in or inhabit this in-between time. Thanks for listening.